but it really has to do with the theme of urban development, of urban planning. For me personally, the area of acoustics, the urban setting, design of cities has been of personal interest for a long, long time. And too often that model is done on a very limited basis as to what's important. If we look at some of the very adventurous city planners of the early 20th century globally, where they were aggregating people together in multiplexes, high-rise cities, because it was such an economically efficient model to do it. They underscored one important point, that they failed to acknowledge that people were at the heart of settlement. And as we've had come through a number of times this morning in terms of migration, is it an economic issue, is it a demographic issue, is it a whatever issue? We've had underscored time and again the values proposition, the social context, and if we don't look at these things from those particular perspectives and just look at them from an economic perspective, then we will not answer the problem, and we will in fact create more problems than we think we've done. And so in the context of a state which looks to have more people settle within it, the most urbanised state of any in Australia, with the highest percentage of that urbanisation taking place in one place, namely the city of Adelaide, it's very important that in a migration update conference, from a perspective wider than just the economics of efficiency of settlement, that we look at the strategic planning for the Adelaide region. So would you please welcome Professor Jon Kellett to speak to us on that matter.
Well, good afternoon, everybody, and thanks to the Dunstan Foundation for inviting me. I was very surprised when I received the invitation, because I'm an urban planner, I'm not a demographer, I'm not a migration specialist, so you'll forgive me if I get it wrong. But I probably do have something to say about how Adelaide is shaping up and how South Australia is changing in an urban sense, and how that relates to population studies. So my interest is very much how the city is changing and how it will change in the future, and particularly how the analysis of population and the projection of population into the future will direct what we do and inform what we do in all sorts of ways. So in very simple terms, strategic planning involves taking the population projections and then extrapolating from that how much land are we going to need for new housing, assuming certain density provisions are applied to new development. How many children are we going to have of school age in 10 or 20 years' time, and what are the implications of that for the amount of school places and therefore school building that we will need to undertake, and where in the metropolitan area and indeed outside of it is that likely to happen. And then at the other end of the life cycle, how many hospital beds and aged care facilities are we likely to need 20 or 30 years down the track to cater for, as we've already heard, a rapidly ageing South Australian population. So there's a very real and practical application of a good deal of what we've heard this morning in terms of strategic land use planning. The way that South Australia tackles this is to have a 30-year planning strategy for the whole state, which it divides into a number of different volumes. And of course, probably the most significant of these is the 30-year plan for Greater Adelaide, not least because it's the volume that deals with around 80% of the current state's population. Certainly speaking as a well, not quite so recent migrant from the UK, I came here about 10 years ago. South Australia is a very, very strange place. It's huge, and it's got one city as far as I can see. It's got a few other places that I think are very small towns or villages, but some of them call themselves cities, but yes, it's odd. Now, how does this work? Here we are. one of the things that it's worth recognising at the outset is that we've changed our definitions when we talk about Adelaide as a city. And forgive me, but when I'm talking about Adelaide throughout this presentation, I'm not talking about the square mile of the city of Adelaide. I'm talking about this metropolitan sprawl that we, most of us, inhabit. But even so, the successive strategic plans from the 1960s onwards, and there have been several up until the most recent 30-year plan, all took the definition on the left under the 2006 banner of the metropolitan area of Adelaide as the statistical basis for planning. And as you can see, it includes essentially the built-up area of the metropolis plus the Adelaide Hills to the east. But when the 30-year plan was generated around 5 or 6 years ago, it was published in 2010, it changed the definition. And the definition of Greater Adelaide became something much more significant, probably 5 or 6 times in the land area, stretching from halfway to Port Wakefield in the north, all the way down the Fleurieu Peninsula to Cape Jervis and Victor Harbour in the south, and extending over the Adelaide Hills, the natural green buffer that planning has fortunately managed to largely retain to frame the city, stretching over the hills and well out to the east on the other side. So we've got a definitional problem which has caused some issues when it came to forecasting, projecting the demographics for the 30-year plan. The plan itself, I've taken that quote directly from it just to bring out the main elements. Looks over 30 years ahead from 2010. It prepares, it says, for a steady population growth of 560,000 people in Greater Adelaide. It translates that as requiring 258,000 additional dwellings. So by implication, it's a household size of just over 2 people per household. It argues that that extra population will require 282,000 new jobs, and that will generate economic growth of $128 billion. The plan then goes on to try to elaborate on where those people will be located, where the jobs will be located, and how the infrastructure, particularly of transport, will link them all together. And then it has quite a bit to say about the city and its history, its character, its environmental heritage. And it talks about climate change too, which has been a topic that I see as bubbled to the surface occasionally in the discussions we've had this morning, and it's something I'll come to a little later. Oops. I'm not handling this very well, am I? Okay. Let's just establish what the population trends are in South Australia over the last few decades. If we look at the green line, which is natural population increase, so that's the births and deaths, we can see that from the early 80s through to the early 2000s, it was gradually declining. So we had a falling population if we just saw it in terms of natural population increase and decrease. The red line is the interstate migration. And again, you can see it's not a pretty picture as far as South Australian economy is concerned, because we consistently lose people, and only on a couple of occasions have we managed to get that line into the positive and above the 0 mark. So we're gradually losing people through interstate migration. It's overseas migration, the blue line, that really makes the difference to the South Australian population. And you can see that fluctuates quite a bit And in the last decade or so, certainly from the early 2000s up to around 2010, we had quite a spike, largely, I think, driven by the promise of a mining boom and all of the hype about how South Australia was going to be the new Western Australia, and get in now, buy your property because it's going to double and treble in value as the mining boom takes off. If we look at the last 5 years, so we're looking at 2008 to 2013, this is the picture. We've got a slow natural increase. Births do outnumber deaths, but it's far from dramatic. It's under 7,000 a year. The interstate migration remains negative. We lose people to Western Australia and to the eastern states. But the overseas migration boosts the figures so that we've got an annual population growth of around 16,500, which is just over 1% per annum. But do bear in mind that was probably a high compared with some of the figures that we saw for earlier decades. Where is that population locating? Well, we've talked about urbanisation as a worldwide trend this morning, and it's very clear that Metropolitan Adelaide is the destination for all of that population, or the vast majority of that population growth. The northern and the southern suburbs are the big takers, as we would expect, because they extend, they're bigger than the western and the eastern suburbs for reasons of natural constraints. Outer Adelaide is growing reasonably quickly, but is certainly outstripped by the existing metropolitan area. And then once you get out into regional South Australia, you're talking about much slower growth. The population projections in the 30-year plan assume an increase of 18,500 per annum in Greater Adelaide. And they build their employment and housing demand projections on that figure. Now, what we see is that annual average population growth is roughly 2,000 less than that. So you could argue that the population projections used in the plan were somewhat heroic. Indeed, there was a good deal of criticism at the time that the plan was put together of the figures that were used. And I think those criticisms rested really on 4 grounds. First of all, the use of Greater Adelaide as the basis for the plan, as opposed to the Adelaide Statistical District as previously defined by ABS, was a major problem. Of course, ABS has since redefined its areas and now uses Greater Adelaide too, but at the time that the plan came out, that was before the ABS had made that revision. Secondly, there was uncertainty about the growth assumptions which underlay the projections. I don't think that they were as clearly spelled out as they could have been in the technical background papers that were used for the plan. Were those assumptions based on previous trends? Were they based on trends for the whole state or for Metropolitan Adelaide? It's not entirely clear. Thirdly, there was some further confusion because ABS itself revised its 2006 census statistics upwards, actually, from 1.554 million to 1.568 million for South Australia as a whole. It decided it got it wrong at the 2006 census and made a change. Finally, the technical report on population for the plan drew conclusions about population change in Greater Adelaide from those ABS revisions to the South Australian population as a whole. And whilst it's true that most of the growth, as we've seen, does go to Greater Adelaide rather than regional South Australia, it's perhaps a little sloppy to make assumptions on that basis. So there were issues with the plan, and the actual population monitoring does suggest that that the plan was over-optimistic in terms of the figures that it put forward. What we're now seeing is state government suggesting that it's going to update the plan. It says, I'm quoting here from the state government website, the plan is regarded by the state government as robust and fundamentally sound, does not require a wholesale change. The directions and principles are to be evolved and refined. So there is an updating process going on, and one of the update that will take place does include, you see, revised population and dwelling targets. So I think I've spoken to a number of planners in practice around the state. They say that the DPTI is currently revising its population figures, and they will be released to local councils soon, and of course that will have knock-on effects on land allocations and so on. But so far, the figures appear to be embargoed. So much for the underlying logic of the plan. I'll come back to detailed planning issues in a few moments, but I think one interesting question that is worth addressing, and it's a perennial topic of debate with students, is what capacity does South Australia have to grow? Is it environmentally constrained? I think Paul mentioned issues of environmental constraints earlier. So I'd just like to explore that question for a little while, because that dry environment that we often mention when we're describing South Australia has, of course, driven urban development and constrained urban development in certain areas. Whyalla, for example, up in the north of the Spencer Gulf, didn't have a water supply until the middle of the 20th century, and it used to literally have to ferry in its water from across the Gulf until a pipeline was installed, I think, in the mid-1940s. Adelaide itself has had to draw on a pipeline and water from the River Murray, which itself has suffered from major over-abstraction in its upper reaches, and that has caused a good deal of consternation over the years. So the issue of water supply is a problematic one, and one that was addressed in a study early this century in the Waterproofing Adelaide study, which outlined a number of strategies such as demand management, better water catchment area management, aquifer recharge, and more recently, of course, a desalination plant, which opened in 2012, as well as a pretty comprehensive approach to using domestic water tanks and capturing rainfall from roofs, to all of which to reduce the supply on the public network. And that's been remarkably successful. I think we now face a situation, partly as well due to wet winters such as we just experienced, where we can have more confidence in our water supply. And Paul and I are probably going to disagree on this one, but desalination plants, particularly if they're powered by renewable energy, I think could be argued to be a very positive asset, which really open up the potential for expansion. The desal plant in Adelaide has not been called on in a major way because, ironically, of course, as soon as it was built, it started to rain. But it's been criticised as being expensive and too big. But I think the other side of that equation is its infrastructure, which is sitting there and allowing us to expand with some confidence. The other big issue is energy. I'm a big supporter of decarbonisation and the shift towards renewables, and I think really that is the only way forward, particularly for a country like Australia, which is blessed with fantastic renewable energy resources. But the state is already progressing well on that front. Coal is down by half in terms of the primary energy mix in the last 5 years. 33% of our energy was produced by coal in 2010. That's down to 17% in 2014. We have the highest rate of rooftop PV installation in Australia. We're generating 704 gigawatt hours during 2014, which is 18% of Australia's total PV output. We also lead the nation in terms of wind energy, with 26% of our electricity generated by wind. We have 40% of Australia's wind development. So we really are making great inroads in terms of shifting the baseline in terms of energy. And we have enormous potential. The two maps here, on the right, you have the wind resource map. The red areas show the wind speed, and you can see that the coastal areas, the Eyre Peninsula, the Yorke Peninsula, and of course the Mount Lofty Flinders Ranges are all eminently suited to the development of wind energy. And we've seen, as I've said, quite a lot of that already, but there's far more potential that remains unexploited. On the left is the insolation map. So the darker yellow and red colours show the higher potential in terms of sunlight falling per square metre of land. But even the green and the blue areas down in the southern part of the state are extremely well placed. In fact, the insolation, the amount of sunshine that falls on South Australia is roughly double that of the sunshine that falls on Germany. On the 25th of July this year, Germany produced 78% of its electricity from renewable sources. Germany is a third the size of South Australia, and it's got over 50 times the population. I think those statistics demonstrate how we've only just scratched the surface and how far we could go. I suggest that 50 years from now, when the world is seriously engaging in decarbonising its economy, South Australia will be regarded as one of the most productive and fortunate places in the world as far as its energy resources go. And if we're talking about attraction of people and businesses, there's a really major selling point if we choose to grasp it. Now, the second question that I'd like to address is, where will this urban development take place and what form will it take? This is Greater Adelaide again, of course, and I've highlighted a number, the red circles indicate a number of expanded and expanding settlements. Really, if you're taking a strategic overview of land use planning for South Australia as a whole, then you have three potential pathways forward. You can either say, well, we'll just concentrate on the existing Metropolitan Adelaide and we'll allow it to grow bigger and bigger in the way that Melbourne and Sydney have tended to do. Or we could be very radical and we could say, let's decentralise and divert our growth into a new city. So let's decide to draw a line under Adelaide and in this massive state decide to have a second major urban settlement. Or we could compromise and look at some sort of means of hedging our bets. And I think it's that third approach that largely characterises what the 30-year plan has done. The fact that the definition of Adelaide has moved from its existing metropolitan area to this much larger Adelaide metropolitan region is evidence of that. The fact that we have new or at least expanded settlements in Gawler and Roseworthy up in the north, and Mount Barker, the one in the middle, and perhaps by default Victor Harbour down in the south, which has become a major destination for retirees and has expanded quite rapidly in the last decade, all are evidence of the view that we are looking beyond the existing metropolitan area of Adelaide for growth, but we're not prepared to go as far as, say, let's designate a whole new city, as we attempted perhaps in the 1970s with the Monarto plan. Some of you might not be familiar with that. It was a proposed entirely freestanding new town on the other side of the Adelaide Hills, a bit further to the east than Mount Barker. But it didn't eventuate because a new state government came in. It looked at the population forecasts, it looked at the economic activity, and it decided it was too risky. And probably, I suspect, made the right decision at the time. We're seeing, however, an emphasis on growth, mainly of existing settlements, in the case of Mount Barker, Gawler and Victor Harbour, and then a new settlement, or a new growth area on the coast up in the north at Buckland Park. I think we need to see this in the context of what happened in the 50s and 60s with the growth of Elizabeth in the northern suburbs of Adelaide. Elizabeth was designed as a completely freestanding new town with the motor industry as its economic base. But of course it's been swallowed by suburban expansion northwards of the metropolitan area in the ensuing years. I think it's absolutely critical that we ensure that Mount Barker, for example, does not become another suburb of Adelaide, that it continues to be divided and protected by the Hills Face zone, which should never be allowed to be developed. At the same time, I think we need to look seriously at the linkages, the transport linkages between areas like Mount Barker, and I would propose that state government should seriously look at a new rail link to Mount Barker, because it clearly is a dormitory town more than a freestanding economic entity in its own right. Gawler and Roseworthy, you could argue, already do have a rail link, but at the same time, I think it's important that economic development is channeled to that area so that we're not simply ferrying train after trainload of commuters into the city centre. And I think Buckland Park is a significant mistake because it's largely a dormitory settlement with no real economic plan and no plans for transport links to the city, as well as being in a potentially vulnerable area as far as sea level rise is concerned. So I think there may be some questions to be asked in relation to that particular proposal. Might need some new batteries in this machine. Coming back to population, I think it's interesting to look at the different profiles of different areas and what the implications of those might be for physical development of the city. This is Greater Adelaide as a whole, And I think two things stand out here. First of all, this very large shoulder of people who are reaching the end of their working lives and are going to become retirees over the next census period or the one after. And that's an indication of how we've got such a strong aging trend in the population. But I think the optimistic note comes with the 20-year-olds to 30-year-olds, where we've got some expansion, which apparently is due to international and interstate migration of young people, which is something that we really must maintain over the next decades in order to rebalance the population and ensure that we don't end up with it being enormously top-heavy. If we compare, for example, two very different places, Playford in the northern suburbs, where we've got a substantial growth of young families, people who see that housing up there is perhaps more affordable and are moving in that area, a much more balanced and secure-looking population structure, as compared to Victor Harbour with its shift of sea changes and an extremely top-heavy profile, which clearly will have huge implications for aged care in the long run, and perhaps might have some implications for those caring migrants who might come in and seek work in dealing with that aging population profile. And then if we compare the city of Adelaide, the square mile of the CBD, with Mount Barker, which I've already spoken about, again, extremely different profiles with a significant movement of people to in the 20 to 35 year age group, largely, of course, driven by the enormous numbers of students who are studying in the city, but also young singles and childless couples starting out on their careers. And that has translated, of course, in terms of physical form, into an apartment building boom in the city. Whereas with Mount Barker, we see a continued development of the typical South Australian format of detached dwellings, low density, to cater for families with children. Though I would question whether that is necessarily the best way forward. I mean, as a metropolitan area as a whole, we have a massive oversupply of 3 and 4 bedroom houses. And maybe we should be thinking about smaller units of accommodation, which inherently might be more affordable too, even in places like Mount Barker and Playford, where we will see a greater population mix in the future. Another interesting thought which occurs is if we're going to take migrants, particularly from non-European origins, then their household structures may be very different from the ones that we consider the norm in Australia, so the extended family lifestyles, for example. And maybe developers should start thinking about building something other than 3 and 4 bedroom single-storey bungalows to cater for those different demographic needs. To come back to the question of what form will development take, the 30-year plan has defined a series of transport corridors. The yellow are the rail lines and the blue are the strategic road lines. And the plan makes it clear that much of the growth of those, 280,000 new dwellings will take place along those transit corridors. And for reasons of trying to shift people away from their overwhelming car reliance and onto public transport. So if we densify those corridors, we'll have more people living within, say, 800 metres, an easy 10-minute walk on either side, and they're more likely to use public transport if a decent public transport system is provided. And that's a big if, of course, in some instances. But what that might look like, could you just click on that link, is shown in this little simulations if they come up. Just to give you an idea of how state government is thinking about the transformation of the existing corridors like Port Road into more dense transit-oriented corridors. Thank you. So the idea of more people living with good access to public transit is a key driver of the plan, and one that has certainly environmental concepts and issues of greenhouse gas emission reduction and so on at its heart. The plan also looks at land supply and how we will find land for all of this new development, and it divides it up into really two broad streams, the two white boxes at the top, the urban growth areas largely on the fringe, and infill, whether that's small-scale development infill, subdivision of existing housing plots, or large-scale windfall development areas within the existing metropolitan area. And the key thing to note is that there's a very ambitious target of 70% of new development being within the existing built area of the city. So the idea is to try and densify and intensify the existing city with only 30% of development occurring on greenfield sites on the outskirts. And that's largely driven by two things. It's driven by a desire to get more people on public transport, reduce greenhouse gas emissions, have a more transport efficient city, and also it's driven by concerns about infrastructure costs, which I'll come to in a couple of moments. The other thing that the plan does is to try to ensure a 15-year supply of zoned land for urban development at any given time. And that, compared with international policy, is extremely generous. You won't find many places in the world that are zoning 15 years' worth of land supply around their cities. It's clearly designed to address housing affordability by increasing the supply of land and therefore maybe controlling its cost to an extent. And I think it's also driven by a desire to help the house building industry adjust to what are really quite new conditions. We're also seeing a new approach to planning, a new layer, if you like, of activity. This is the Inner Metropolitan Rim Structure Plan, which you can see the area that it deals with around the outside of the parklands, which has many of these transport corridors running through it. And it's an attempt to really assist local councils in developing their new development plan zoning to accommodate the aims of the 30-year plan. How that will be achieved, particularly through small-scale infill, is interesting. These are taken from a couple of government documents that show the different processes of, for example, demolition of an existing house and its replacement on the left by a single dwelling, but more desirable, of course, is the scenario on the right, where you've got demolition of an existing house on a large plot and replacement by two dwellings. or you get re-subdivision situations where an original dwelling is kept, but its large allotment is used for further development. And in fact, the state government's been monitoring this in some detail. Between 2004 and 2010, we had 10,755 dwellings demolished and 18,000, just short of 19,000 new dwellings built as replacement. So it's quite an effective mechanism. We're getting 1.7 dwellings built for every one demolished, and that is boosting the supply of dwellings by about a third. A third of the total of new dwelling stock growth in Metropolitan Adelaide each year is small-scale infill and intensification of this nature. The other major way that we're seeing development occur is larger infill sites. This is Light's View, about 8k to the north of the city, where we've got 80 hectares of formerly undeveloped land, which is being developed as a sort of model mixed-use development at higher densities, with lots of local facilities provided, with an explicit aim of improving the health and activity levels of its residents, and again shifting them away from car dependency. And other examples, of course, are the Bowden transit-oriented development just on the northwest corner of the Parklands, and the Tonsley, former Mitsubishi site, out near Flinders University, which is an interesting spot to visit at the moment. One of the big issues is infrastructure. How to fund the required infrastructure in new development, and there's a huge debate going on right now about what's the best way forward for this. The government says that it's much cheaper to build infill and concentrate within development within the existing metropolitan area, and the building industry says no, it's much cheaper to build on the fringe. In fact, they're both right. It depends who's paying. Government has commissioned some interesting work by consultancy Infraplan, and this has been backed up by a number of other studies, which show that typically it costs about $20,000 per allotment for infill development infrastructure, but $60,000 per allotment for fringe development infrastructure. Whereas those are the costs to government. But of course, the developers find it much easier and more efficient to build on large greenfield sites on the fringe, because in most cases they're not paying for the infrastructure that's provided, they're passing on the costs of that to the house buyers. So it's a fraught situation, and I think the government is probably right for infrastructure reasons as well as environmental reasons to try to concentrate development within the existing built boundary of the city. We're also seeing, as we speak, I believe, in Parliament, the new Planning Development Act is being debated. We've had a 2-year process of planning system reform, which is leading to new legislation. I'm not implying that this will necessarily lead to a policy change, but I think it is driven partly by the need for new mechanisms to implement the 30-year plan. I think one of the problems that the government ran into was it produced this fairly radically different strategic model, and then found it quite difficult to implement it without extra powers. Almost finished, but I'd just like to say something about one of my pet topics, which is climate change. The 30-year plan does recognise that Adelaide needs to respond to a changing climate. All of that transit corridor development based argument, I think, is largely based on the idea of the fact that oil prices are only going to rise in the future, that we're facing a crisis in terms of greenhouse gas emissions, and public transit is one of the ways that that can be tackled. But at the same time, as well as mitigating greenhouse gas emissions, we are going to have to adapt to the changing climate that is already locked in. We've already done a good deal of the damage, and sea levels will rise, intense heat waves will come along more frequently, we will have more and more intense weather events, and we will have to design our cities to cope with them, even if tomorrow, by some miracle, we were able to cut our greenhouse gas emissions to zero. So all of these figures are just sort of quick impressions of the sorts of things we're going to have to talk about. Green roofs to mitigate urban heat island effects, more efficient public transport, sustainable water design to capture and control runoff within the urban area. Certainly some major consideration of what's going to happen on our coasts and how we might tackle increasing storm surge threats and erosion. And on the bottom right, some of the German passive houses from Freiburg, which are actually not only carbon neutral, but they're pumping back energy into the grid. They're independent little power stations in their own right. So we've really got to think about that, and it's not just population issues which will drive how our city changes, but its response to these major environmental threats. If you'll indulge me for a moment, I couldn't resist this one. I'd just like to speculate. In this strange state with its one city, will we ever see a time when we get other major urban developments? And if so, where would they be? Now, I'm looking forward not just to the end of this 30-year plan, maybe not even to the end of the next 30-year or 50-year plan, but it's going to happen sometime. Most of us won't be around to see it, but where will the next city in Adelaide be? Well, space is the first thing that you require to build a city, and there's no shortage of that. I imagine that the model that we've followed around the rest of Australia, with the key exception of Canberra, is coastal cities, big coastal cities. So let's rule out all of the northern part of the state where, after all, climate change is going to make it more and more intolerable to be in the first place. Out in the far west, well, maybe, but it would be very remote, halfway between Perth and Adelaide, poorly connected, probably not the primary choice. Port Augusta, Whyalla, Port Pirie, that area up at the head of the Gulf, well, we've already got existing settlement there, but again, if we were to look at the migration trends, it's probably net migration away from those areas for various reasons. And we might run into difficulties with desalination plants up at the head of the Gulf because of water flow and tidal scour and so on. So we don't want it too close to Adelaide because we don't want to run the risk of just creating one vast metropolis that is going to swallow up all the delightful resources such as the Adelaide Hills. So my bet is the Mount Gambier region. However, politically, of course, could be a hot potato, because what have we got just next to Mount Gambier? We've got Victoria. Would we be economically shooting ourselves in the foot as South Australians if we allowed that kind of economic leakage into Victoria? I emphasise that's pure speculation on my part. If there are any journalists here, please don't run away and say Adelaide's next city is going to be Mount Gambier. But I think it's perhaps appropriate for a conference on population and, from my talk anyway, urbanisation, to end on that sort of long-range speculative note. Thank you.